This is the NuPhy Field75 HE, a magnetic reboot of the company's popular mechanical gaming keyboard that was released about a year ago, which brings the ever-expanding capabilities of Hall effect keyboard switches like rapid trigger and snap tap to a familiar, though quite masculine design. It's worth noting here that the original mechanical Field75 remains in the NuPhy lineup and has many of the same buttons and aesthetics as this HE version, so some of what I'll talk about will relate to it as well. However, one notable trade-off I'll mention up front is that the mechanical version offers wireless connectivity via Bluetooth and a 2.4 GHz radio frequency connection, while the HE version is currently limited to a wired connection only. However, the magnetic version pulls at a crazy 8,000 Hz compared to the 1,000 Hz of the wired and RF polling on the mechanical Field75. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, this keyboard was sent to me by NuPhy, so while I do my best to be honest and share my perspective on it, this is something that you should know. That said, let's check out some hardware highlights, audio samples, and the new NuPhy IO software controls, as well as my overall thoughts. As I said in the beginning, this keyboard has a very masculine gamer guy vibe, which in many ways is in line with the primary customer I think NuPhy is going after, but could also be toned down a little. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the little text cliches that are printed around the keyboard, but I do appreciate the amount of controls that were added to this slightly oversized 75% 83 key keyboard. At first glance, the Field75 HE looks a lot like the Limo key L1, with its volume scroller and the G1 to G4 buttons grabbing attention along the left side. However, you'll also note that the NuPhy has included a dedicated mode switch to quickly jump between the default Mac, Windows, and gaming modes that can easily be reconfigured using the company's software to support OS or even game-specific settings. It's also worth noting here that each of these modes has 4 layers associated with it, so there are a ton of options for customizing the key mappings and Hall effect settings of this keyboard. Above the mode selector, you'll also note a small planar scroll wheel, which is currently locked to changing the backlight brightness via rotation or toggling through effects when pressed. I've asked, and NuPhy may eventually allow users to remap the controls of this and the volume scroller, but there isn't a time frame in place to add this functionality. Finally, there are 4 more G buttons along the Field75 HE's chin, which are conveniently textured and located to allow for easy triggering from my resting thumb position. These, along with the left side G buttons, are currently remappable using NuPhy IO and are driven by small micro switches that feel a lot like mouse buttons. For the sake of completeness, here's a quick audio sample. Other than this, the Field75 HE has an aluminum grab bar on its left end, which honestly I've used way more than I thought I would while transporting this keyboard around over the past few weeks. It also has a bank of 3 feedback LEDs sandwiched between the print screen and delete keys that communicate information about things like caps lock, which of the 3 modes is currently enabled, as well as the trigger and release acknowledgements for each key press. This can be disabled and re-enabled independently in each mode using function and T if you find it to be annoying. Personally, I don't mind it, but that's in part because the little LED cluster isn't too prominent, which may not be the best thing if you find yourself missing whether or not caps lock is enabled. Finally, it's worth noting that in addition to the polished NuPhy badge, there are 2 kickstand feet on the underside of the Field75 HE, which elevate the typing angle from the default 4 degrees to a more comfortable 9-degree position. Oh, and based on a few weeks of use, I would recommend pairing the Field75 HE with a palm rest of some kind. If you want one to perfectly match the slightly larger width of the keyboard, NuPhy sells one specific to the Field lineup. However, I find that my classic Keychron wooden one works just fine. Really, the only other potential negative thing I would say about the Field75 HE construction is that the case is ABS rather than metal. That said, The keyboard weighs in at just over 1.2 kilograms, which is a very comfortable heft, whether you need to transport it or want it to remain stable on your desk. Rounding out the keyboard's aesthetic, NuPhy has paired the Field75 HE with a set of color-matched, cherry profile, double-shot PBT keycaps. These have nice, clear, and large legends, and of course, NuPhy's KeyTalk collaboration Ghost Bar that's intricately constructed to diminish the hollow sound of the spacebar. We'll hear that in just a sec. Beneath the keycaps, we find south-facing RGB backlighting, an improvement over the north-facing mechanical Field75, as well as the switches that give this Hall effect keyboard its ability to tune keystroke actuation, among other things. If you aren't yet familiar with magnetic switches, the main takeaway is that rather than the traditional mechanical switch, which connects two metallic pins to complete a circuit when pressed, these switches have a small magnet on the base of their stem, which creates a magnetic field that can be detected by a small Hall effect sensor on the PCB. The benefit here is that the signal is continuous and analog rather than simply digital, which allows the keyboard firmware to respond to partial key presses instead of a single on-off actuation point. The downside is that there aren't nearly as many magnetic switch options available as there are mechanical ones, which means the Field75 HE users are currently limited to the white double rail and jade magnetic Gateron switches that NuPhy is offering when you initially configure the keyboard. These are both smooth-feeling, pre-lubed linear switches that range from 30 to 50 grams force along their stroke. However, the white switches have a slightly longer actuation range of 0.1 to 4 millimeters compared to the jade switches, which are 0.1 to 3.3 millimeters. Honestly, in use, I've struggled to notice a big difference between the two. In short, and this is true of all magnetic keyboards right now, the Field75 HE trades the ability to tune switch feel by swapping in an endless number of mechanical switch variations for a few linear options that offer far more customization over the key trigger and actuation settings. It's also worth noting that the Field75 HE intentionally has a very stiff construction, with a top-mounted PCB paired with an aluminum plate. This minimizes the signal variations induced by keyboard flex, allowing the keyboard to offer an extremely fine 20-micron actuation tuning, which is pretty wild. That said, in classic NuPhy fashion, the Field75 HE case is sealed with snap locks, so you can't get inside to tinker or modify the internal construction with ease. The internal construction simply includes a thick layer of pour-on plate foam, as well as a layer of case foam atop a fitted silicone slab. But let's have a listen to what it all sounds like together. All things considered, the Field75 HE isn't the thockiest keyboard I've heard, but its stiff construction gives it a solid clacky tone. As expected, there isn't much of a difference between the white and jade switches, perhaps a slightly more aggressive strike sound on the jades because of their shorter travel distance, but overall both feel and sound pretty similar to me. And the pre-lubed stabilizers are pretty well balanced right out of the box. Finally, let's take a look at the new NuPhy IO web app that has been launched alongside the Field75 HE to make the most of these magnetic switches. As I'm making this video, it's August 2024, and NuPhy IO is still undergoing development, so keep in mind that things may look a little different in the future, and as I'll note, a few features are still missing. When you launch the web app, you're greeted by a very bright and clean aesthetic. This is something that carries throughout the interface. To get started, you select a mode that you'd like to edit, and then you're taken into the main configurator. Keep in mind that you can jump between modes at any time using the physical toggle switch on the keyboard. On the right side of the default key binding tab, you'll note that each mode has 4 layers available to it. So you can select the layer that you want to edit here, then modify key mappings by simply selecting a key from the keyboard display and reassigning it as you wish. There's 2 drawbacks to note here. You can't currently modify either of the keyboard's scroll wheels, nor can you create and assign macros to the keys yet. I have assurances from NuPhy that macros are coming to NuPhy IO and are expected in the next few weeks. However, this was a real bummer for my testing because I was hoping to remap many of the G keys to custom functions for productivity and video editing. That said, the company has prioritized the magnetic features in the short term, so by right-clicking on any of the magnetic keys, you can have the option to jump into dedicated controls for setting up dynamic keystrokes, which allow for up to 4 actions to be triggered by a single key press based on the stem position, as well as mod tap, where you can assign different functions for tapping versus holding the key. I find these particularly handy for the number keys, or toggle key, which makes the key toggle between held on and off states with subsequent presses. I've also been assured that the Field75 HE will be adding the controversial SODC or snap tap functionality in the coming weeks. This allows for more rapid positional movements during gaming. For more information about this, check out Optimum's video about Wooting's implementation of snap tap that I'll link in the video description. NuPhy IO also offers the standard backlight lighting effects controls that we've come to expect from configurators like VIA, though again with a clean and intuitive implementation, as well as a mode settings page where you can change the keyboard's polling rate and toggle on and off some handy distraction limiting things like win-lock. It's also worth noting that from the top right corner of NuPhy IO, you can access a general settings page which contains a handy firmware updater. But really, the core functionality of the Field75 HE's magnetic switches are controlled within the Trigger Settings tab. Here, you're presented with a very clean graphical interface that allows you to select a single key, group of keys, or all of them at once to change the actuation point, top and bottom dead zones of the switch, as well as the rapid trigger settings, which allow you to tune their press and release sensitivity. All of which can be tuned in increments of 0.1 millimeters or a wild 0.02 millimeters. Perhaps this degree of sensitivity is something pro gamers need, but it's far beyond my capabilities. What I really like about NuPhy IO though is just how intuitive the whole interface is. There are plenty of explanations peppered throughout the web app, and I really like the tie-in that's provided with the live view of the key press visualizer. This is handy when you're tuning your actuation point. Oh, and I should mention that this is where you can assign white or jade switches to each key, and you can also use the software to perform a keyboard-wide calibration. All things considered, at a pre-built price of $150 USD, the Field75 HE is an expensive but interesting keyboard that offers a solid, though plastic construction, paired with a lot of added functionality that I think many will find appealing as an entry to magnetic keyboards. As I mentioned, the aesthetic is probably most similar to the more expensive, though all aluminum LimoKey L1, but that lacks the magnetic functionality of the Field75 HE, which also comes in cheaper than the metallic Q1 HE that I've previously reviewed. Interestingly, the previous mechanical version of the Field75 is also $10 more expensive than the HE when it's not on sale, which I think will lead a lot of buyers towards this magnetic version, provided that you're okay with the linear switch limitations. Finally, while the Field75 HE's magnetic switches, 8000 Hz wired polling, and strong aesthetic are clearly targeting a gaming aesthetic, I think there's an opportunity for NuPhy to soften the look a little to make it more appealing to a broader audience, including non-gamers who could also benefit from the numerous actuation-related settings that the magnetic switches create. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.